Hi, my name is Laura Siciliano, and in this seminar, you're going to learn a little bit about creating a trauma-sensitive learning environment. So just to start off, let's answer this first question. What is trauma? Trauma is a reaction to a severe threat of injury or death that leaves the person feeling terrified or helpless. So trauma can occur at any age, but specifically for our purposes, and because I'm talking to an audience that is primarily educators, um, I would like to just focus on childhood trauma. I will say also, though, that trauma has become kind of an important buzzword topic recently because of the links that have been found between childhood trauma and chronic health problems. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So just to get started, there are three main types of trauma. The first type is acute exposure, and that would be, for example, a child who's been involved in a car wreck or a natural disaster, or maybe even something as terrible as a school shooting. But if it was just a single occurrence, then that would be considered acute exposure. Excuse me. The second is chronic exposure. For chronic exposure, that would be a child who has been exposed to domestic violence in their home or neglect, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, or homelessness. And then the final one that we're going to talk about is intergenerational exposure, which is also sometimes called historical exposure. And that one's a little more complicated, but it can involve something that has been happening over many, many generations to a specific culture. Like, could be slavery, could bring up that type of trauma. Within the reservation systems, it could be tribal, or it could be communities of longstanding poverty, even just in areas where there have been years and years and years and generations of tremendous poverty. Or it even could be something like the Holocaust. All right, now, so for our most vulnerable groups, the first is going to be students from under-resourced communities. This could be either urban or rural, and it could be communities that have seen a lot of gang violence, housing insecurity, even where the child welfare system may have been involved, or the juvenile justice systems. The next group is children whose parents have substance abuse problems. Children who come from households where there is a lot of drug abuse and alcohol abuse are 2 times more likely to have experienced physical, sexual abuse, as well as neglect. And then we've got our LGBTQ youth, and unfortunately, they're more likely to receive verbal victimization from their family and their peer group, as well as rejection from their family and peer group. And that could be, that could cause some lasting trauma. And then we have immigrant and refugee students. Before immigration, studies have shown that 80% of these kids have witnessed killings, assault, and many of them have even suffered captivity. Another stress that is related to this community of students is the stress of deportation and separation from family. 2 years ago, I had a young girl in my 4th grade class, and one morning I could tell she was really upset, and I got everyone started and pulled her aside to talk to her. And she said that she was just really scared that her parents were going to get taken by the immigration. She had watched her uncle get uh, get taken from the family by immigration services, and she was afraid that her dad and her mom were going to get taken also. And it had just never really occurred to me that a student who was so close to me in my classroom and that I had a relationship with and knew on so many levels would be going through that type of trauma. I really wasn't prepared for it. And so it's just another reason that I think it's so important for teachers to be educated on what some of our kids have gone through and how we can best help them. So going back to our vulnerable groups, the last one is our students in special education. And these students are more likely to have been exposed to abuse and neglect because of their disadvantages. And people often will take advantage of a student who's not able to communicate as well or doesn't understand what's going on maybe. So very unfortunate. All right. So the next thing that we're going to talk about a little bit is how we recognize trauma in our classrooms. As you see, there is an exhaustive list here. And I am going to take a minute just to read them over to you. So as I'm reading over this list, teachers, you might look at it and just start thinking about some of your students who frequently are exhibiting these different behaviors, not once in a while, but things that you see daily, or when you see more than one of these at a time in a child, that might be a sign of childhood trauma. So their inability to focus, a deep withdrawal, suspicious and not trusting. They might leave their seat for no reason or blurt out. Definitely a lack of impulse control, an inability to sit still, repetitive behaviors. They may appear anxious by twirling their hair or sucking their thumb. They may be clingy or needy or lack boundaries. They might hug strangers or people that they've just met. They may have an overreaction to the movements of their peers around them. They're probably extremely aware of negative body language that's coming from you. So might not necessarily even be your words, but they may perceive the way that your body is looking to them as something scary. They may misinterpret events and feel that things that happened are all their fault. They may have trouble with transitions or any change in the schedule at all. They may frequently have complaints about different pains in their body and need nurses' visits more often than other students. They could be aggressive, and they might show physical or emotional or verbal aggression towards others or towards teachers or even towards themselves. And then there's avoidant behavior. That would be students who are not interested and refuse to participate in lessons or do not want to go on class excursions or trips that they would normally, that students would normally find very interesting. So overall, to me, the best way to really classify these types of behaviors is just students who are not able to self-regulate in order to adapt to any changes. So, if you have a calm classroom already and there's something that happens in your classroom that triggers the student, they're not able to adapt in any way. All right, so the next thing that we're going to talk about a little bit is the ACEs. And ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it came out about 10 years ago. It was a couple of doctors who were doing research and started to notice some trends in adult health problems. So what they noticed about these, they did a poll or a survey of 17,000 adults. And what they did is they asked these adults about some childhood experiences, trying to find a common link. And these three classifications are neglect, household challenges, and abuse. And under neglect is emotional and physical. Household challenges would be domestic abuse, parental drug abuse, parental mental illness, divorce and separation, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and then another one that's not on this list, I believe that was later added, is if there was a parent who was incarcerated. All right, so when they asked these 17,500 adults these questions, they found that 67% of them had at least one of these adverse childhood experiences. And then they found that 12% of them had greater than 4 adverse childhood experiences. So what was interesting to these doctors was that of that 12%, the incredibly high rate of chronic health problems in that adult group. So what they discovered is that of that 12% of the people who had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, they had chronic health problems, they had mental illness, they had substance abuse issues, and it was almost all of them within that group. So as far as children go, children with an ACEs score of 3 or more are more likely to have a lower IQ, a lower GPA, an increased rate of suspension and expulsion, a decreased IQ, increased absence, and a decreased graduation rate. All right, so just to talk a little bit about how trauma affects the developing brain. And this is what those two physicians went on to study, because they noticed that those individuals in that 12% had all these adverse childhood experiences. So they started studying their brains. And so really, I'm going to talk to you about the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. So those 3 parts of the brain have very different jobs. Your prefrontal cortex is your learning brain. So it's responsible for thinking and logic and what to do and making decisions, evaluation. It's responsible for impulse control. So this is really your learning part of your brain. Now, your hippocampus is also important. It regulates your memories, and it also regulates your emotions. Remember that your regulated emotions kind of has a lot to do with your behavior, because your emotions affect your behavior. So the next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the amygdala. And the amygdala is really the superstar of your brain, because it's responsible for keeping you alive. Your amygdala is what turns on your fight or flight response, and it also stores memories of events. So this is really, if this is your learning brain, this is your survival brain. So your learning brain is very important, but your survival brain is literally necessary to keep you alive. So the way that trauma affects the developing brain is kind of like this. So imagine that you're walking through the forest, you're on the trail, and all of a sudden you see a bear, okay? So your amygdala immediately goes to work, and it turns on that fight or flight response, and your heart beats fast, and you might start to sweat a little bit or shake a little bit, and that is your adrenaline getting ready to move. All right. So during that time, these two parts of your brain are not doing anything. They are in relaxed mode so that they can send all the energy and all of the blood to the amygdala. All right, so that's a really important response to have if you're walking in the woods and you see a bear, right? Okay, but what if that bear lives in your house with you? All right, so that is what chronic trauma is like for a child. And that amygdala in that situation is always working, working, working. And it works so hard that it shuts off these different parts of the brain. And that's why we might see children who have been exposed to chronic trauma who they might not be able to learn very well, and they also might not be able to control their emotions very well. All right, this is all a symptom of that chronic trauma. And it isn't just a coincidence, it's actually something that has happened within their brains. And that's kind of why you see this little picture of the amygdala guy who's so strong and these guys who are just really struggling. So this video is a good way to kind of understand a little bit better how that works.
And afraid of getting things wrong, and they don't feel back. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff. And they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, Stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Hey, welcome back.
All right, so actually, I love that video. I love the explanation of the survival brain versus the learning brain, and I really love the elephants. And then actually, I'm just going to say I picked up a new quote that time. He said that people with trauma misinterpret ambiguous situations for stressful situations or something like that. And just thinking about how many times that's happened, where something will happen in a classroom and I don't think anything of it. And I noticed that one of my students has just shut down. And, being trauma sensitive means that, that I understand what's going on. And, I can't prevent every instance of a child going into survival mode, but, at least I can be aware of what's going on and be sensitive and let them know that they're safe. So that's kind of the part that we're getting into now. As I was researching this topic and teaching teachers how to help students with trauma, the overwhelming thing that I noticed was that it went on and on to talk about how important it was for teachers to take their oxygen first. And that's why that little quote's here. And remember, if we don't take our own oxygen before we help others around us, we just can't be of any service to anyone. And, as teachers already know that helping people is, can be very exhausting. And when you've got a child who is exhibiting some of these erratic behaviors, it can really be even 10 times harder. And so, it's important for us to know our triggers so that we don't get into downstairs brain. And downstairs brain is, that brain that has got the amygdala in it, that survival brain. If I've got a child who's in downstairs brain, it's very important for me not to slip into that also. And, for me, some of my triggers personally or my biggest trigger is definitely exhaustion. I can also be triggered if it's, if I'm feeling very hungry or if one of my security instincts has already been kind of messed with that day. And maybe I had a bad morning with my kids or my boss said something to me that I thought was, wrong. And I just need to be aware that, when I'm not in fit condition, that, if I do have something happen in my class, that it can turn, from something that could have been productive into something, that's really not productive for anyone, and nobody can win. I'm in control of my classroom essentially, and if I'm not showing up with enough sleep and enough emotional just stability, then I'm not able to help those kids academically and definitely not emotionally. So I don't know. I don't think that teachers do enough of this. So, it is important to practice self-care and know what that looks like for you. It might be getting your nails done or spending some time reading or taking a nap or, exercising, but whatever it is, just know what you need to be whole so that you can help others. All right. So the next thing is this important question. A lot of times, and I'm absolutely guilty of this. When a child's having a meltdown, I think, or I say even, why are you behaving like this? And, that's so silly to think that a child would be able to explain to me the reason for his behavior. And what I really need to do, and what we need to do as teachers, is to change our vocabulary so that instead we're asking what happened to him that caused him to behave like this. Because this child is not, he's not doing it, to upset me. He's doing it because something scared him, something triggered that amygdala response. All right. All right, so now a little bit about what a trauma responsive classroom might look like. So first of all, it's important for us to be transparent and predictable with our students, especially students who've suffered from traumatic childhood experiences. That just means it's real simple, and most of us probably are already doing it, but our schedules are posted and our students are aware of changes in advance. If there's going to be a visitor to the classroom that they've never met, they've been warned about that, and they know what's going to happen so that they aren't always feeling surprised. All right, next is classroom layout. This I feel is very important. Even for me personally, I like to be able to see into all the corners of my classroom so that I know that there's, no one or nothing that's that I don't know about going on. And it's important that my exits and my entrances stay visible to the students and that everybody has adequate space. Some students might not like to have anyone sitting too close behind them. Some students might not like someone too close beside them. And as a teacher, we've got to be very sensitive to that. All right, next is subject matter. I think as elementary teachers, it's not quite as difficult, but we do need to be aware of sensitive subject matter and things that might trigger a child's, inner fears and might cause their learning brain to turn off. Remember, that's our goal, is to keep that learning brain, remember the rock at the top of the hill and not sliding down. All right, next, external stimuli. These can't always be helped, but it's important to be aware of things like sirens, screeching brakes, fighting, yelling. Those are things that could also cause a child to slip into that survival brain. It's important to provide a calming corner in your classroom. And I wouldn't say that that's really what that corner is in that picture, but a calming corner is a place in your room that engages their senses through touch and sound and sight. You could include stress balls and a headphone set with some calming music. You might have coloring books, Play-Doh, just different sensory items that are sort of going to help that child to self-regulate and calm down. I was thinking for my older students, 4th grade, I might have maybe some yoga cards, some deep breathing posters. I always do like those squishy balls. I've always got some teddy bears in there for squeezing and some pillows for yelling into if you need to, or just just holding on tight. Sometimes that's what we really need. So I really do think that a calming corner or cozy spot in your room where a child can go when he needs to decompress is really important. All right, so speaking of decompression, all right, next thing we're going to talk about is de-escalation. So once a child gets into that survival brain, you know that there's no learning going on. So if you've got a quiet corner in your room, that's fantastic. And you might, if the child knows that he's getting there and you have a signal, then you might be able to, to do that signal. Or I don't know, I think it might be a good idea to have sort of a, maybe a nonverbal signal with the child, or even if you had like a little sign that both of you knew, so that he would know just to slip away into that spot. So once you get there, first of all, you notice it says self-regulation. So remember, as a teacher, the most important thing is to stay in upstairs brain. Make sure that you've got what you need to help them through this problem. All right, and then your student regulation is just, make sure he knows he's safe, distract and redirect. I like the idea of that a lot. That's where kind of those sensory objects come in, that calming corner. The next part's really important also. It says listen and reflect. So when a child is having a breakdown like this, they could say all kinds of words, and it doesn't really matter what they say, but listen for the emotion. So instead of saying, I'm sorry that Billy hit your or broke your pencil, instead you could say something like, I can see that you're very angry. And that is sort of just like naming that emotion that the child might not be able to explain verbally. I like this. It says, when seen, heard, and understood, people shift from stress to rest. And I like that. So it's important for us to make sure when our children are stressed that we can see them and hear them and understand them. All right, so once your child has calmed down a little bit, or once your student has calmed down a little bit, it's time to try to reconnect and work through a resolution. So you might be able to understand why the student was upset. It's not important really to know the background, but it is important to figure out what triggered them so that maybe you can avoid it in the future. You might have to discuss what the consequences and the actions are. If their outburst had a behavior that is, that breaks one of your classroom rules, then the consistency is important. So they will have a consequence. And then again, to encourage connection for future success, so that, as these things happen in our classrooms, that the child feels connected to us and is able to come to us and to count on us when it happens consistently. Okay, so in closing, so I really like this this picture. It's a little bit blurry right here, but it just makes so much sense to me. Because as a teacher, as I was researching all this, I kind of felt helpless. Like, how can I help my students to get through this? It just seemed like so much. But, if your childhood exposure is down here, your ACEs and your ACEs and your trauma, and then your outcomes are right here. And this proximal means your recent outcomes, so like school, and then this is the distant, this is your future. And you see these happy people, and you see this little graduation cap. Well, this is the reason, okay, is we're gonna put the schools and the teachers right here, because we actually can make a difference, okay? We can step in and we can be that person who is going to listen when our child or when our students have got difficult things going on. We're going to provide safe environments instead of threatening environments. It only takes one strong relationship, one strong adult bond to actually rewire their brains. And we can be the difference in a student's life, even a student, and especially a student who has suffered a lot of these childhood adverse childhood experiences. So with student and teacher, you know, stuck into this picture, then your proximal outcome, you know, shows academic achievement and socio-emotional wellness. And in the distal outcomes, you've got better health outcomes, stable employment, and lower incarceration. And that's what we really want. So anyway, I hope you've learned some things in this video. And what I really hope, though, is that you'll take time to research some different methods that'll work well for you, because this is not a problem that's going to go away, but it is a problem that that we can help with. So thank you so much for watching this today.